Farber believed that the American way of life was completely dependent on consumerism and how much someone can buy. Hi, and welcome to Decade News. I am Brittany Hayward, and today we're going to be talking about David Farber's book, The Age of Great Dreams. In Farber's book, he solely focuses on the 1960s. It was a very interesting and eventful decade. When someone thinks of the 1960s, they probably think of, John F. Kennedy and his presidency and his assassination. They probably also think of the civil rights movement and Vietnam and the new culture within young people, such as rock and roll and the Beatles, coming over, and also the freedom to express themselves, because that wasn't, they weren't able to do that, before the 60s as much as they actually were now. And an aspect of the book that Farber actually really focuses on, like he touches on the other ones, but he solely focuses on, and he puts all of the blame of the entire 1960s on what is called the economic marketplace. Farber believed that the American way of life was completely dependent on consumerism and how much someone can buy. He believed that people were defined by what they had and how much money they could spend. It's said in Farber's book that by 1960, telephones, televisions, refrigerators, and electricity to power them were accepted as an American birthright. And fast cars and cheap gas were markers of the American way of life. So, what's so bad about being able to afford houses that are nice? What's so bad about, having white picket fences? And what's so bad about having a television? Because, people have access to, political issues, through the media. And they also have, that inspires them, if they are educated, that they can vote more. In 1960s, during this decade, more people were voting because they had access to this media, because they had more of a say than they actually did before. A lot of people had no idea, what each candidate stood for. But now that, it was broadcasted, they were actually able to, engage and be able to participate. Now back to the previous question, what's so wrong about buying things? He believed that buying, consumer product can actually lead to selfishness and self-indulgence, which became the norm of that time, he says. And Farber also mentioned that this consumerism gave economic and political power to everyone. Do I believe it? Not 100%. It's a really interesting idea. I mean, I can see where the political power and the economic power can go to the consumer who's actually able to buy. But no, they're not going to have as much power as someone who can actually afford everything. When Farber says marketplace, he does not only mean the buying and selling of goods in a marketplace. He means that the world is a marketplace for America, and that each American and individual, their beliefs, ideals, every aspect of their life is influenced by this so-called marketplace. And it gives them the feeling of, I have freedom. I have freedom of choice. I can buy whatever I want. I can buy whatever TV I want. That also means that I can question things that normally people don't question, like, well, why is the government doing this? Or why did my boss do that? Because it gives them a sense of, like, self, that they feel like they've achieved something. I believe that all of the issues that occurred during the 1960s actually originated with the death of John F. Kennedy. Although the marketplace may play a big role, I feel that his death caused a domino effect that affected everyone. Kennedy was looked at as, an amazing president. He targeted everyone's concerns and everyone's wants. And he promised to, take people or bring people back from Vietnam. He targeted many of the major issues that America was dealing with himself. Even in the documentary that was presented on the webpage or the Blackboard, even, he sat with Congress, but in the end, he wanted to make the final say. And the Americans, just clung on to that because they had hope. They had hope that their loved ones would come back from Vietnam. They had hope that things would change because they, after the 50s, just kind of started dropping whenever it came to, them being satisfied with the things that, the way things were. So after his death, just everyone took it horribly. Congress and the people. He didn't look at America as two different. He didn't look at it as the government and the people. He looked at it as one unit. And that is what set Kennedy apart. Another point that Farber focuses on is the War of Vietnam. I believe that Vietnam and the death of Kennedy, they're tied together because once he died, Johnson took over, and when he took over, he did not follow through with what Kennedy was attempting to do with the war. He was wanting to bring everyone back, but Johnson actually decided that they needed to send more troops out, and people did not react in a very nice way. And eventually, towards the end of the decade, in the end of the 1960s, people just didn't even care much about the war anymore. Because it had been going on so long and just nothing was being done, they just, stopped worrying about it so much. I wouldn't say worrying, they just stopped making a big deal out of it. Farber did a really good job at pointing out the important aspects of the 1960s. One thing that he touched on that was a very big deal was the Civil Rights Movement. Back in the 1860s, supposedly after the Civil War, the slavery was supposed to be abolished, which it was in a sense. However, racism continued. And there were still, by the 1960s, there were Jim Crow laws in the South that, there's still the segregation. And during this time, people decided to stand up for their rights. They decided to believe in themselves, and they looked at themselves as someone with a purpose rather than just, oh, well, I can't do anything about it because that's just the way things are. And that's what 1960s became a time of change. So there's a book called America Dreaming, How Youth Changed America by Laban Carrick-Hill. And this particular book supports the idea of the consumerism in America, as Farber explained earlier. And but it actually takes kind of a little bit of a turn. The first one explains about how everyone is able to afford everything because they make it available. But the second one actually shows, the result of that. So, economist John Maynard Keynes coined the term relentless consumption to describe the new era, meaning that as long as industry produced enough goods and services to employ most of the country, people would have the financial means to purchase these goods and services and better their lives. The argument concluded that nearly all economic and social issues would be solved because goods and services would be plentiful and affordable, and people would have the income to purchase them. So it's just saying, okay, well, sure, it's bettering their lives because everyone can be equal and have equality, and they can afford to buy new TVs or buy nice houses, But because these houses are all the same, there's no difference, from one person to the next, which would sound good in a sense. But if you go down farther in the book, it actually says, one person's paradise, however, can be another's hell. Social critic Lewis Mumford tartly characterized these suburban utopias as actual suburban dystopias. A multitude of uniform, unidentifiable houses lined up flexibly at uniform distances on uniform roads. In a treeless command of waste inhabited by people of the same class, the same incomes, the same age group, witnessing the same television performances, eating the same tasteless prefabricated foods from the same freezers, conforming in every outward and inward respect to a common mold manufactured in the same central metropolis. Thus, the ultimate effect of the suburban escape in our time, ironically, a low-grade uniform environment from which escape is impossible. So, and then it completely switched around, and it was saying that although it's affordable, not everyone was happy with that because they're just the same as everybody else's. And that just proves that due to the affordability and, the marketplace of America, and that means that everyone, their beliefs, their ideals, their actions, everything they own, and the way they live is influenced by this economic state that the nation is in, which some people consider a good state because they're like, oh, I can buy a house and I can, support them for my kids. But at the same time, depending on how much you're making, you may be forced to live a certain way due to this economic crisis. The next book that I chose is called The Conquest of Cool, Business Culture, Counterculture, and the Rise of Hip Consumerism, and it's about the 1960s. The reason I chose this particular book is because it's actually targeting an area that I haven't had a chance to talk about yet, and it was actually focused on a little bit even in the Farber book. So it's actually about like the civil rights of women and women's rights, and they protested and tried to get equal rights just as much as the African Americans did. But this was their view on like the feminist campaigns and like on society as like a consumer society. So Abby Hoffman's counterculture of thieves may have prefigured certain characteristics of later varieties of American consumerism. It's exaggerated hedonism, for example, but he clearly conceived it as a direct subversion of the affluent society. This ambivalence informs us much of the counterculture's larger self-understanding as well, even as it provided business with a cultural vehicle for its new understanding of consumption, even as it introduce a new array of mores appropriate to new modes of accumulation. Many of its participants understood it as diametrical opponent of the commodity fetishism in which consumerism is grounded. Feminists writing from the 1960s was particularly conscious of consumerism power to create the narrow boundaries within which American women were forced to live. A 1970 essay of Alice Embry specifically confronts the various feminist campaigns discussed above in observing that. The mass media molds everyone into more passive roles, into roles of more frantic consuming, into human beings with fragmented views of society. But what it does to everyone, it does to women even more. The traditional societal role for women is already a passive one, already one of a consumer, already one of an emotional, not intellectual, who isn't supposed to think or act beyond the confines of her home. So she is feeling the effect of the consumerism, as a woman, more, obviously it's an opinion, but she feels like it's affecting her a lot more than it even did the men. Because she's, they had jobs, but still in the 1960s, like a lot of the men were working in the factories and women were still technically supposed to be taking care of the kids and doing kind of like minor things. So because of that, and that the world was ruled by the great marketplace and consumerism, is that she was feeling the effects of that because she's forced to live a certain way due to that. And there's one more sentence that actually says, Money was not the measure of all things. Under no conditions could products, even drugs, bring happiness. And I'm going to end that particular excerpt with that one because that pretty much just says, money doesn't bring happiness. So the last excerpt that I'm going to be reading is from a book called The 60s Cultural Revolution in Britain, France, Italy, and the United States, 1958 to 1974. And it was located on the New York Times on the web. And this, I'm actually going to be just reading a little bit to make a point of how people felt privileged in order to have the, be able to have the opportunity to be able to consume and buy and sell items, and they felt like they were succeeding in life. But it says massive improvements in material life so that large sections of society joined the consumer society and acquired mod cons in the backward areas. This involved the arrival of electricity, together with inside lavatories and properly equipped bathrooms. Those who railed and rail against the consumer society of the 60s forget how welcome it was to those who were only in the process of joining it. So they looked at it as a privilege. However, once they got so used to it, they didn't actually realize they were living in a consumer society because it just kind of became like part of them. It became part of everyday life, and they didn't actually realize that the society was turning into this, major issue that Farber was talking about. Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of Decade News, where we learned all about the 1960s and David Farber's book, The Age of Great Dreams. I'm Brittany Hayward, and I will be seeing you in 2 weeks for the 1970s. Have a good night.